even less sort of tools, documentary tools at their disposal, right? A documentary filmmaker can edit and do all kinds of things behind the scenes. If you're broadcasting live on television, you have far fewer tools to kind of control the image at hand. So that promise is certainly present in Soviet television as well. And it's also very true of later shows. And I just want to show you, partly because it's one of my favorite things ever. This 1980s game show, maybe I should introduce it briefly. So it's a quiz show that started in the late 70s and continues to be on the air today, and indeed it's played in kind of informal leagues in the United States among expats, very popular kind of game outside of television as well, a little bit like Jeopardy or something you can play in schools, or there might be clubs or whatever, called What, Where, When. And the premise, as you'll see once we get through this awesome sign-on, is there's a group of, a sort of team of young whiz kids who sit around and debate questions of kind of factual questions posed as riddles. So the difficulty is not in the factual information, but in figuring out what the question's really asking and knowing the answer. So this owl is its main sound for they're starting their first round, and kind of set in a casino around the roulette wheel, excellent vintage hairstyles. But here are these very serious whiz kids, and they represent kind of an intellectual elite, right, of the same kind that early television people wanted to feature as kind of model Soviet individuals, mostly male. And you get the sense of the camera work, right? The kind of camera's going everywhere. It's like a first-person perspective, a very frenetic, excited one. And these are letters from viewers. They got the questions, viewers versus the team. So the television viewers send in the questions, and then they would pick a letter. And here's a definitely fake photo of that television viewer whose letter this supposedly is. So actually they use their friends, the people who produce this. So then they get this question, and it's read out loud in this weird voiceover that's not really in the room. You never see the guy. This is like a big thing in the show. He was a very kind of a celebrity TV director. He reads out the question, and they have 1 minute to debate its answer. The question is about what's something that you can see in the present that originated exactly 8 minutes ago. It's 8 minutes old anyway. I didn't quite listen carefully enough to translate it exactly. But the answer is a ray from the sun. So here they have this moment of debate, right? And here you can see the kind of previewing of political discussion shows. It's basically a round table. There are all these kind of young intellectuals. They're students of elite Moscow universities, all terribly serious. And they kind of debate this topic, this riddle, and how they're going to answer it. And then the commentator would sort of, he's not doing it here, but in subsequent years, kind of at least in less than a year, he was already kind of commenting on the action. He would stop the action and admit that it wasn't live, and say, look, he just missed the correct answer from one of his compatriots. The show is ostensibly meant to propagandize teamwork. So it was sort of bureaucratic reform. They were supposed to get together and model how you might make decisions in an enterprise or in a factory in a way that was democratic and kind of unbureaucratic.
What years was this again?
This is 1980. So yeah, I mean, there are many, many things to respond to in that show.
Do they compete against each other in any way?
You know, they changed the rules a lot, and that was sort of part of the idea. Is this, again, it was this idea of play as a place for experimentation and kind of trying out of new potential futures. So they would change the rules all the time, like even within the show, or certainly over the course of a season, and over the course of the show, the rules changed radically. Where they would experiment with having like multiple teams in the studio who would take turns playing against the viewers at home, versus just having the one team that plays the viewers for the whole match. At some point, they have the audience in the studio participating as well as a kind of third party. And then as you go into the 80s, I mean, it really changes radically. They bring in, they have a whole set of teams all competing against each other and the television viewers. And anyway, I won't go into the details, but yes, they experiment with the rules constantly as a way of kind of experimenting with these new kind of ways of living, basically, and sort of making decisions and this kind of discussion format. So among many other things that show tells us, it certainly fits within Grusin and Bolter's framework of remediation, the use of this camera work of this particular variety that kind of disorients and also appears live, right? It's sort of drawing on live television, which is already extinct in the Soviet Union in this period, though it comes back, and the show becomes live once live becomes possible again. It also draws on the same kind of, some of the cinematic tactics, breaking frame, sort of swooping around and disorienting the viewer. And my question, I guess, as I look at all this, in some ways this all applies, Grusin and Bolter's ideas of sort of, again, focusing on immediacy and hypermediacy. There too you see, right, the sense of you're right in the action, the camera gets up in people's faces, you know, it's this very active kind of photojournalism. At the same time, right, you often, I don't know if we saw it there, but frequently on the show you would see the cameramen as kind of players in the game, right? You would be able to see them from another camera, and you would have the sense of this is a TV show, right, and you're in this studio. So Grusin and Bolter's concept applies so kind of directly and obviously to Soviet television as well, that on the one hand I find this extremely useful because, you know, Soviet media, or Soviet history in general is so characterized by these kind of major ruptures, right? Extreme state violence, World War II that was much more disruptive there than it was here, for example. You know, Khrushchev's criticism of Stalin, Khrushchev's ouster, and Brezhnev. There's sort of sense that every 5 or 10 years there's some major political rupture, right, that utterly changes the game. It's nice to sort of look at Soviet media in a way that emphasizes continuity, right, and the ways that these things came forward more or less continuously despite the extreme ruptures. And the show like this still being on the air, right, it goes right across 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. So it's very useful to look at Soviet media in terms of continuity. But for me it also kind of raises the question for this concept of, you know, does it apply so well to everything that it loses some of its analytical value, right? Does it explain, is this true of all media everywhere, then what does it really tell us, right? It's certainly useful in contrast to other ideas about how media change, but what kind of traction can we get from it if it also incorporates Soviet media? And Grusin and Bolter do accept that it applies largely to Western media, but sort of argue that it's more intensively true of recent media, or that it's more true of American media than media in Europe, where there is more sort of technophobia among the elite. Soviet Union also had that, but I think it's more like the United States in its desire to have kind of utopian views of what media can do for us. So I thought what this suggests to me is that it might be useful to kind of turn to the question of what the real experience that media is promising us a transparent experience of, like what is this actual thing that we're supposed to be experiencing more intensely. That seems to change a great deal historically over time, right? In the late 1950s, the reality that we are supposed to have this transparent relationship to, the reality that we are going to get immediate access to, is intended by these, again, kind of not yet anti-Soviet, sort of enthusiast television workers to show us the revolutionary transformation of Soviet life toward communism, right? This is a very utopian period. They're thinking that as they show us these crowd and street scenes, we're going to see how Soviet life is becoming what it's supposed to become, a sort of true communist society characterized by sort of joyful expression and whatever else it's supposed to be characterized by. That changes very dramatically over time in Soviet television from the late 50s to, for example, this show. Despite the kind of continuity in concepts like play and penetrating new vision, what you're supposed to see and what you're supposed to have access to does change a lot. So for this show, to take an example, since it's very much in the same tradition, this director was absolutely an elite creative director, was traveled in high intellectual circles, was respected by sort of the whole Soviet intelligentsia in the 70s, had a lot of very influential friends, was viewed as kind of a genius. His objective with this show, as he wrote openly in 1982, was to prepare individuals to kind of develop themselves and compete in an increasingly corrupt and difficult world. So it's a very different view of what Soviet reality is. And I brought in a few kind of quotes from his book about this show, just to give you a sense of that. So he retains this kind of view of himself as for those of you familiar with Russian art history, sort of constructivism, right? Himself as a constructivist. That is someone who changes the conditions of everyday life in order to kind of make possible revolutionary new ways of living. So about the show's content, you know, he